The rain that morning had a particular elegance, if rain can be said to possess such things. Not the insistent sideways variety that blows in from Cowley, but a quieter weep, steady, vertical, disinterested in drama. It slipped down the leaded windows of Blackwell's, drawing faint lines over the cover of a first edition in memoriam that someone had placed with a certain reverence in the window display, spines aligned like choir boys. I stood across the street, coat collar turned up though the cold hadn't quite committed, and watched the book. Not with the intention of buying it, I already owned 2 copies, both annotated in moments of misplaced certainty, but with the melancholy satisfaction of seeing that no one else had either. It had sat there for 3 days, untouched, unsold, unread. The students now passed by with AirPods in their ears and caffeine in hand, glancing not at Tennyson but at their own reflections in the glass. I stepped inside for the warmth, browsed a little without meaning to, then drifted back out again. The streets had begun to glisten. I made my way to the covered market, then took the long route home, through Magpie Lane, where someone had drawn a chalk heart on the flagstones. There was something desperate about it, as if written for someone who wouldn't walk that way again. My flat was too warm. The radiator was doing its best to remind me that I lived alone. I peeled off my coat, poured the first whiskey of the day. Medicinal, I told myself, though the ache behind my left eye was more metaphysical than physical, and set the gramophone to Wagner. The notes unfolded like something long buried resurfacing. Slowly, mournfully, with purpose. There is a loneliness peculiar to late morning, especially when one is neither working nor truly at rest. I stared at the half-finished crossword on the armrest. All washed up and yet not wet. 5. I traced the square with my finger. Sober, clean, dry, none fit. I looked again. 5 letters. A trick, perhaps. I thought of how many answers pretend not to be what they are. That was the pleasure of them, and the sorrow. It was just after the adagio that the phone rang. It never rings well. Stranger's voice was as it always was, perfunctory, a man trained to round off his vowels and his conclusions. I could hear the sound of office movement behind him. A life had ended, he said, in North Oxford. A woman, Clara Hemsworth, professor of something literary. I closed my eyes and imagined the name. Too clean to be young, too pointed to be content. The body had been discovered in a bathtub, water still drawn, but the skin dry. That's what the report said. No dampness, not even the beginnings of it. I listened without speaking. Sometimes silence is more reliable than questions. He wanted me to take a look, he said. It might be something, or it might be one of those deaths that confuses only the living. I told him I'd be there within the hour, though I meant 2. I poured what was left of the glass into the sink and shut off the gramophone mid-phrase. The record spun once more, silently before stopping. On the walk to the car, I thought again of the clue, all washed up and yet not wet. A metaphor, certainly, but also a fact now. A woman had died surrounded by water but untouched by it. The rain continued softly as I turned the key in the ignition. Oxford shimmered faintly through the misted windscreen. Nothing looked out of place. It rarely does. Wycliffe Crescent was the sort of street Oxford reserved for its quieter intellects, the ones who published rarely, lectured rarely, but were spoken of often. The houses were red-bricked and symmetrical, their front gardens composed like stanzas. A clipped box hedge here, a gravelled path bending just enough to suggest deliberation. Number 7 looked no different, except that the milk on the step had not been taken in. Lewis stood waiting outside with the discomfort of someone too decent to resent the cold, but too practical not to mention it. He nodded once as I approached, then glanced down the street, as if hoping the answer might be walking toward us in a well-cut coat. I told him not to hold his breath. Inside, the house felt staged, not in the theatrical sense, but in the way silence can sometimes be arranged deliberately. The air had the faint scent of rose water and old paper, and the walls, painted in shades of cream and ash, gave off no opinion. The piano in the sitting room bore a single sheet of Debussy's Clair de Lune, open at the first page. No dust on the keys, no smudges either. Her books, and there were many, were shelved in the kind of order that suggested not perfectionism, but intent. Alphabetical by author, sub-sorted by century. Poetry separated from prose. No annotations visible from the spine. I found myself wondering if she ever lent them out. I suspected not. The bathroom was at the top of the stairs. Clara Hemsworth lay in the tub as though sculpted there, pale, composed, arms resting lightly at her sides. The water, which had long since cooled, still trickled faintly from the tap, offering a sound that seemed deliberately inconsiderate. She wore a simple black slip, soaked only at the hem. Her skin, aside from a faint bloom along the collarbone, was utterly dry, even the ends of her hair. I looked for the usual accompaniments, a wine glass, a discarded robe, a towel draped with carelessness. There was nothing, only a yellow tulip on the windowsill. It was not yet wilting. I stepped back into the hall as Mrs. Fenwick was led down by one of the constables. Her hands were folded tightly into themselves. She was the kind of woman who apologized even for silence. She'd come to clean, she said, as usual. Wednesday mornings, always the same key, always left under the frog statue by the hydrangeas. She had let herself in, called out, and heard only the tap running. The upstairs door had been ajar. She'd found her, like that. No note, no noise. She hadn't touched anything, she added quickly, except the phone. I asked her if Dr. Hemsworth had been troubled of late. Mrs. Fenwick paused. Not troubled, she said. Just distant. Though she'd always been distant, hadn't she? I let her go. Lewis returned with his notebook half full and his eyebrows raised. A neighbor had seen someone the night before, just after dusk. A man. Tall, she said. Academic type. Tweed. She couldn't recall his face. No car, no name. No one else had seen him, or at least no one else had said so. Oxford has never been in the habit of volunteering things. Back upstairs, I entered what must have been her bedroom. The bed was unrumpled, her nightdress still folded on the edge of the pillow. On the bedside table, a book of Hardy's poems, spined and creased in the middle, and a crossword, Yesterday's Times. Inked letters in neat square handwriting. Only one clue left unanswered. To drown in silence. 6. I stared at it for a moment, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my coat. A puzzle, half solved, like so much else here. Before leaving, I returned once more to the bathroom. The tulip had begun to bow slightly, its head dipping as if in deference. The water still whispered from the tap. There had been no violence, no struggle. But there was something else. The kind of absence that doesn't just happen. The kind that is arranged. I closed the door behind me and told Lewis to check every flower shop in Oxford. He looked surprised, then nodded. Outside, the day had dimmed. Rain still lingered on the leaves. I lit a cigarette I didn't want and stood there listening to nothing. St. Hilda's never quite abandoned its reputation for producing formidable women, nor did it try. It clung to its history like ivy to stone, quietly insisting on its own significance without ever raising its voice. Even the gravel on the footpath seemed arranged to discourage unnecessary footsteps. Lewis and I walked the quad in silence, the wind picking at our coats as though Oxford itself disapproved of intrusion. The porter directed us to the English faculty with a brief nod, his eyes too knowing, his mouth too discreet. Professor Gerald Vale's office was on the first floor. A large window looked out over the meadows. though he didn't seem inclined to notice. He was pale in that way men become after too much quiet and not enough contradiction. A long, intelligent face, with little left in it but formality. Clara's death, he said, was a loss to scholarship. The phrase landed with all the warmth of a footnote. She was due to deliver a lecture next week, The Semiotics of Cleanliness, Bathing, Guilt, and the Victorian Body. The title struck me as both oddly personal and academically guarded, like most things here. He had read the abstract, of course, but hadn't discussed the content with her. Clara had, he said, preferred solitude where ideas were concerned. And where people were concerned? I asked. He hesitated. She was precise, he said. Not cruel, not warm, just measured. It was an answer that sounded rehearsed, and I didn't entirely fault him for that. Dr. Penelope Searle arrived shortly after, uninvited but not unexpected. She wore a crimson scarf with studied elegance, as if mourning required color to make its point. Her voice, when she spoke, had the glint of something sharper than grief. Clara, she said, had always had a taste for irony, and the power to hurt with it. I asked if they had been friends. Colleagues, she replied. And then, after a pause that said more than her tone, no, Clara didn't do friends. Her mouth curled as she added, almost admiringly, that Clara had been elegantly cruel. The kind of cruelty that left no fingerprints but was felt all the same. And yet, Clara had students who adored her. I mentioned Aaron Lister. Penelope shrugged, a gesture too fluid to be accidental. Talented boy, she said. Intense, unremarkable, until Clara noticed him. I watched the flicker of something not quite jealousy pass across her face. Admiration, maybe, or the shadow of something long buried. Lewis took Penelope aside under the pretext of a few formalities, leaving me to explore Clara's Don's room. The curtains were half-drawn, the light subdued. It smelled faintly of paper and bergamot. Her desk was meticulously ordered. No stacks, no clutter. Just a fountain pen, a small leather notebook, and a copy of Middlemarch annotated in a tight, looping hand. A framed photograph faced the wall. I turned it gently. A group of 5. Clara, Vale, Penelope, 2 others I didn't recognize. All in their 30s or close to it. The kind of photo taken after a panel or a summer school in Tuscany. Clara was looking away from the camera. There was, on the corner of her desk, another crossword. Same hand, same date, same final clue, left blank. To drown in silence. 6. I sat for a moment, letting the quiet press in. Something in the spareness of the room struck me. Clara had lived here, certainly, but not in the sense most do. There were no photos of family, no mementos. Just books and the tulip. On the windowsill, this one white, dried, pressed flat against the glass by the months it had been left there. On the way out, Lewis told me none of the students had seen Clara since Monday. Aaron Lister hadn't come to class, but was on leave for personal reasons. The vagueness rang hollow. As we passed the chapel, I stopped and looked back at the quad. A single student in a navy coat walked the cloisters slowly, head down, steps measured. It could have been Aaron, or me, or anyone who'd ever mistaken brilliance for closeness. Some colleges specialize in regret. This one had simply organized it. The office smelled faintly of damp cardboard and overused upholstery. A room never designed to think in, only to record. Lewis sat somewhere behind me, half listening to the radio, and making notes I'd never read. I ignored both. There was a stack of Clara Hemsworth's work in front of me, most of it slim, sparely printed volumes with austere covers and stubbornly quiet titles. Gesture and Decorum, The Morality of Interiors, Cleanliness and the Reader's Shame. It was in the older monograph, Bathers and Martyrs, Ritual and Dispossession in 19th Century Letters, that I found the footnote, page 74, third paragraph. A careful nod to a German essay, Über den Reinigungsakt als Todesverlangen, co-authored with someone called E.J. Rook, no university listed, no publication date, just the name, offered as if one should already know it. Rook, a scholar once, or the ghost of one. There was no trace of him in any recent literature. Lewis, with his usual precision, ran a check. No current academic postings, no articles post-2012, no scandal either, at least not publicly. Just a quiet disintegration from the record. It took 2 hours and a conversation with an unusually poetic archivist at Cambridge to get an address. A cottage near Chipping Campden. Unlisted. Retired, possibly. Or exiled, more likely. I made a note to visit. Meanwhile, the forensics report arrived, as underwhelming as a late post. No fingerprints on the tap, not even smudges. The chrome was too clean, unnaturally so. And no soap anywhere in the bathroom, no dish, no residue, no scent. Just the faint metallic tang of still water. It was, I thought, like walking into a death arranged by an architect. But it was the tulip that held me. Yellow, not white, not red. No card, no vase. Simply placed, its stem already bending toward decline. It hadn't been there long. I called Lewis over, asked if he'd followed up with the florists. He had. Nothing under Hemsworth, nothing under Clara, nothing under CH orders for yellow tulips were rare. One had been made yesterday morning before the body was found. No delivery address, paid in cash. I told him to look again, under silence, if necessary. The tulip didn't belong, or perhaps it belonged too much. It felt less like a tribute than a whisper. Something left not to be seen, but to be remembered. That afternoon, I returned to Wycliffe Crescent alone. The constable on duty raised an eyebrow. I nodded once and walked past. The house still held its silence. It wasn't the silence of absence, but of something restrained, like a hand not yet played. I moved through it without turning on the lights. In the hallway mirror, my reflection looked vaguely disappointed to see me. Upstairs, the bathroom door was still ajar. The tap had finally been turned off. The tub, now empty, bore a slight ring of lime scale around the lip. A faint echo of where the water had held her. No sign of disturbance. No struggle, just a body that had lain untouched by the thing that should have consumed it. I stood for a long time, staring at the curve of the enamel, the place where a knee might have rested. The tulip was gone, taken for evidence or discarded, its absence oddly louder than its presence. The crossword was in my coat pocket. I unfolded it, smoothing the creases on the rim of the sink. One clue still unsolved. To drown in silence. 6. I stared at it, then at the drain. Nothing came. Some deaths ask nothing of you. Others arrive with a riddle and wait, not for sympathy, but for clarity. And Clara, I thought, was not the kind to die without at least one final sentence left unfinished. The Cotswolds have a way of softening the past. The hills roll just enough to suggest mercy, and the air smells faintly of earth and wood smoke, the sort of air that encourages forgetting, if not forgiveness. I arrived just after noon, the sky holding itself in a stubborn overcast, as though refusing the drama of full sun. E.J. Rook lived in a stone cottage on the edge of Chipping Norton, the kind of place one arrives at through accident or intention, but never convenience. There were violets growing along the path and a rusted bell that didn't ring when I pulled it. I knocked instead. Once, then again. He opened the door slowly, as if expecting no one and fearing someone. His eyes were small, pale, and full of apology. The rest of him was quietly untidy. A cardigan buttoned wrong, a sleeve flecked with ink, shoes too thin for the weather. He blinked at me. "Inspector Morse," I said, "about Clara Hemsworth." He didn't ask how I'd found him. He simply stepped aside and said, "You'd better come in." The inside was warmer, cluttered and oddly delicate, like a mind still full of thought, but no longer confident of its own sharpness. Books lived in stacks, not shelves. A kettle sang faintly in the corner. He poured tea without asking if I wanted any. It arrived lukewarm, oversteeped, served in a mug that bore the faded crest of a defunct college society. He sat across from me with the air of someone waiting to be told the diagnosis he already suspected. We hadn't spoken in, 12 years, he said, fingers clasped. Perhaps more. She was always the braver of us. You worked together, yes. Taught together, wrote together. He smiled faintly. Bathed, too, he added, and then blushed like a boy who'd said something indecent. There'd been a scandal, he explained, in the late 1990s. An affair between faculty was discouraged, of course, but forgivable. What couldn't be forgiven was publishing work jointly and then falling apart before the follow-up. Clara had pulled her name from the second paper. The administration had quietly encouraged Rook to take leave. He never returned. She never forgave herself, he said again. Softer this time. But she never said sorry either. She had a way of holding both fire and frost in her, depending which page you were on. He fumbled for something in the drawer beside him, then produced a folded letter, the kind of paper that already felt like a relic. No envelope, just a single page, folded twice, creased diagonally in one corner. It arrived 2 days ago, he said. No return address, but I knew her hand, always slanted left, like she didn't quite trust the words to stay put. I unfolded it carefully. Just one line, written in blue ink. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. And yet I am an island. I stared at it. You recognize it, he said. Dawn, Meditation 17. But she had misquoted it. The original, no man is an island, entire of itself. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. But here, she had written herself out of it. She had turned the bell inward. Rook watched me closely. I think she knew she was going, that she had decided to go. And you, I think I was the one she wanted to tell, but not the one she wanted to answer. He looked away then toward the window, where a single tree stood leafless against the field. There was a time, he said, when I thought I'd spend my life reading her sentences. But even the cleverest people forget how to end things. We spoke a little longer, about poetry, about Clara's habit of buying her own books in second-hand shops and writing new dedications in them. He said she once signed one to herself, from the woman I meant to be. When I rose to leave, he stood as well, uncertainly. I thanked him for the tea and took the letter, promising to return it. He waved the promise away. She meant for someone to read it, he said, not for someone to keep it. The sky outside had not changed. On the drive back, I wrote the misquoted line in my notebook and underlined the last phrase. And yet I'm an island. Clara, I thought, had left that line precisely wrong and precisely true. It was late afternoon by the time Lewis returned, coat beaded with rain and eyes full of small, inconvenient truths. He stood in the doorway of my office like a man who'd been made to walk too far for something too thin. Felix Merton, he said, visiting fellow currently attached to Balliol, but last term he spent 2 months shadowing Clara at St. Hilda's. She'd invited him. They were co-authoring something on narrative hygiene, whatever that means. I gestured for him to sit, though he didn't. They argued last week, Lewis went on. Fiercely. Merton says she removed his name from the paper, said he hadn't understood what it was really about. He says he left her house around 9 on Monday. Walked home through the park, no witnesses. No one saw him leave. No one saw him arrive. That makes it convenient, I said. Lewis nodded. But not impossible. I sent him to follow up with the college again. Too much moved in Oxford by nod and corridor. Things unsaid forming the spine of every conversation. I preferred to walk. The rain had thinned to a sheen on the stones. By the time I reached the Bodleian, my shoes made the quiet squelch of memory. Inside, the warmth wrapped around you with academic condescension. Dust lived well there, respected and undisturbed. I had no real purpose in being there, beyond instinct, and a vague need to look again at Clara's last catalogue request. She had ordered a copy of hydrotherapeutic texts of the 19th century 4 days before she died. It had never been collected. I made my way to the upper reading room, where silence held court like a professor who refused to retire. She was there, of course. Penelope Searle, angled over a folio like a woman reading a confession she herself had dictated. She saw me before I saw her and did not flinch. "Still chasing poetry and plumbing, Inspector?" she said, too softly for disdain but too pointed for affection. I sat opposite her, not bothering to ask. "Did Clara ever talk of leaving?" I asked. Penelope did not look up. "She was going to leave the bathwater behind," she said, then paused, as if realizing something. Too late. I said nothing. Sometimes silence has more pressure than speech. She looked up then, the faintest tremor beneath the cleverness. "A phrase, that's all. We all say strange things. Did she tell you she was writing something new?" She didn't reply, but her hand found the edge of the page she'd been marking and turned it without reading. "Clara didn't like to be co-authored," I said. Penelope smiled without warmth, nor corrected. I left her there, pretending to be absorbed in print too dense to see. Downstairs, I returned the uncollected volume on hydrotherapy to its shelf, though not before scanning the marginalia. One faint underline in pencil, purification as erasure of guilt. A line Clara might have underlined herself, or written. Outside, the rain had begun again in earnest. Students loitered under arches like monks waiting for secular absolution. I paused beneath the eaves, lit a cigarette, and watched the drops chase each other down the spire across Radcliffe Square. It was then I noticed it. The umbrella in the Bodleian returns bin, as if left by someone too preoccupied to remember the weather. Navy blue, gold-tipped, the kind given only to senior college staff. I lifted it. Inside the handle, just faint enough to escape casual notice, a nameplate, C. Hemsworth. It hadn't rained Monday evening. Clara hadn't brought the umbrella to the library. Someone had returned it for her, or claimed to. I stood there a moment longer, the umbrella heavy in my hand, watching Oxford blur and sharpen in the shifting rain. The things people leave behind, umbrellas, names, sentences half-written, often say more than the things they carry. I read it with the reverence one gives to a voice that has already fallen silent. Clara's unfinished manuscript arrived in a battered envelope, passed to me by a tight-lipped secretary who, I suspect, had read none of it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted, elegant, vaguely impatient, as if her thoughts couldn't be bothered to wait for the ink to catch up. The title was printed boldly on the first page, The Semiotics of Cleanliness, Bathing, Guilt, and the Victorian Body. But what followed veered, gently at first, into something more personal, less lecture, more confession disguised as criticism. There were quotations from Ruskin and Eliot, but also long curling paragraphs where Clara spoke, or nearly did, in her own voice. "Cleanliness," she wrote, "is not the opposite of dirt. It is the erasure of history. We do not bathe to become pure, only to pretend we were never stained." The phrase lodged itself somewhere behind my eyes, where certain sentences go to echo. The final pages were missing, torn out, not haphazardly but with careful intent. A scalpel, not a rage. On the second-to-last leaf, the ink had blurred slightly. Tear stains, perhaps, or water from a glass tipped gently sideways. Either way, a kind of drowning. Lewis, ever the reluctant librarian, returned from St. Hilda's that afternoon with a typed draft recovered from the shared printer queue. Someone had printed it 2 days prior, but never collected it. He looked faintly guilty, as if academic theft was a greater sin than murder. There were discrepancies, not just in phrasing, but in substance. The printed version omitted several key passages. Gone was the reference to absence as purification. Gone, too, a footnote, annotated in the handwritten version, suggesting that a prominent paper on literary hygiene had relied too heavily on a previously unpublished thesis. No name was mentioned, but the implication lingered like perfume on an old scarf. Penelope Searle's thesis had once caused a quiet storm in academic circles, hailed as original, barbed, and fearless. It was also, I remembered now, oddly untraceable in its sources. Clara might have known, might have decided to speak, or simply hint. In Oxford, even a hint can be an indictment, but motive. Reputation is currency in academia, yes. Pride, too. But murder is rarely composed in a single key. It plays chords, and the tulip still played in mine. It had troubled me from the start, that fragile, deliberate flower resting on the bathroom sill. Yellow, symbol of unreturned affection or tentative hope, or betrayal. In Victorian floriography, a language Clara would have known, a yellow tulip could mean hopeless love, or a wish unspoken. I rang the florist. I don't remember exactly what I said, only how careful my voice became. The tulip had been ordered that morning, not the night before, as I had assumed. Ordered by phone, paid in cash. No message left. Delivered by bicycle to number 7, Wycliffe Crescent, just before noon. Clara would already have been dead. I sat with that for a while. The bath, the manuscript, the erased accusation, the flower placed like punctuation on a sentence that had never been allowed to end. Perhaps Penelope had found the missing pages. Perhaps she feared what they implied. About her, about Clara, about how far back things really went. Or perhaps she hadn't. Perhaps someone else had read those words and found in them a wound they could not bear, to leave open. Lewis asked, later, what I thought the phrase meant, being made clean through absence. I told him I didn't know, but perhaps it was what Clara had feared, or longed for, to disappear without explanation, to bathe in silence, to erase her own story before someone else wrote the ending. That night, the crossword still lay unfinished on my desk. I looked again at the clue she'd left unanswered. To drown in silence. 6. I thought of ink smudging into tears, of a manuscript torn gently, page by page, of a flower without fingerprints. The answer wasn't there, but the question lingered. And in Oxford, that is sometimes all we are given. I was coming down with something, the kind of illness that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, just a quiet erosion of energy. Joints heavy, mind gauzed in cotton. The heating in my flat wheezed like an old man clearing his throat. Rain dribbled half-heartedly down the pane, grey against greyer. The crossword lay in front of me again, Clara's, folded with care, one corner slightly crumpled as if clutched in hesitation. I'd stared at the clue too long, all washed up and yet not wet. 5. A riddle within a riddle. For days it had resisted. I'd tried clean, ruins, even spent. None fit. But illness has a strange way of loosening the mind, or perhaps tethering it more closely to the subterranean parts. That morning, between half sips of lukewarm tea and the distant moan of a delivery van reversing, The answer arrived without ceremony. Sober. There it was. All washed up. The end of something, used up, worn down. Yet not wet. No drink, no alcohol. A dry drunk. A life drained quietly rather than drowned. I sat with that word. Sober. It felt cruel or illuminating, or both. I couldn't decide. Clara had never drunk in my presence. Wine at college dinners, yes. But her glass was always full, her hand rarely straying toward it. I had mistaken it for preference, temperament, a kind of austerity, but sobriety is often invisible until it isn't. A quiet call to a contact at the JR hospital confirmed it. Clara Hemsworth admitted 6 years ago for alcohol-related complications. A short stay, no record after that, no public slips, dry ever since, and, apparently, privately so. I tried to picture it, her alone in that beautiful airless house, with her Debussy and her hydrangeas and her absence of wine. No single bottle out of place, a life pressed flat into order. Suicide, then? A symbolic undoing, the bath as theatre, the tulip as her own parting gift? But the toxicology report arrived with its own cold grammar. No alcohol. None. But there it was. Faint but unmistakable. Morphine. Not a dose large enough for euphoria, not the kind you take to sleep peacefully. A trace, a breath, the kind that might come from... what? Pain medication, an old prescription unearthed, or something administered, deliberately, by another. Lewis returned with the will. Clara had amended it just a month ago. Neat legal language. Small changes. The surprise was Aaron Lister, her student, the so-called protégé. She'd left him a painting, modest funds, and, curiously, a leather-bound copy of her earliest lectures, annotated in her hand. Lewis looked uncomfortable as he relayed this. Oxford doesn't like its ghosts rearranged after death. I, on the other hand, had long since stopped expecting the dead to stay within the lines. Then the final call came. Strange's voice, slightly rough, held a thin wire of tension. Aaron Lister hadn't turned up for his tutorials, no sign at his digs. Phone off. A note left with his flatmate. Gone to clear my head. Gone. The word held too much ambiguity for my liking. Students disappear all the time, for a night, for a term, for a life. But Aaron's absence was the wrong shape. Not rebellion, retreat. I sat back in the chair, the crossword still open in my lap. One word solved, a dozen more now trembling around it. Sober, a woman who had learned to live dry. A death that mimicked water but avoided it. A flower not meant for mourning but for memory. And now, a boy vanished into fog. Outside, the street lamp flickered. The rain had stopped, though the window still wept. I closed the crossword and, for the first time in days, felt cold in a way the fever could not explain. It was late when I returned to St. Hilda's. The porter, half asleep behind his desk, waved me through with a glance that didn't quite reach his eyes. The college was quiet, the hush particular to these old quadrangles, not silence exactly, but the accumulation of things unspoken. Clara's Dawn's room was as we had left it, sparse, dignified, a scent of old paper and polish lingering in the air, as though she had stepped out only minutes ago. Her desk bore the usual signs of a life steeped in thought. Marked up proofs, a fountain pen still uncapped, a small brass lamp giving off a warm, apologetic glow. I turned again to the framed photograph. It had caught my attention days earlier, not for what it showed, but for how it had been hidden. Face down on a shelf, behind a slim volume of Browning's Dramatis Personae. The frame was modern, too clean for its contents. I prized the backing gently, careful not to disturb the fine dust that settled like ash between the layers. Behind the current photograph, A soft focus portrait of Clara alone, taken in her 40s. There was something older. A group photo. Summer, I guessed, by the sleeve lengths and the quality of the light. 5 figures, standing on the college lawn, squinting into the sun. Clara, younger, still composed but less defended, stood between Rook and Searle. Merton to one side, hands in his pockets. Vale, surprisingly, at the far end. Face unreadable, even then. Someone, Clara herself, I suspected, had circled her own image lightly in pencil. A hesitation, a mark of return. On the back, a line of Latin had been inked carefully in, a scholar's hand. Puritas per dolorem. My Latin is passable, though it has eroded with time. Still, the words were simple enough. Purity through pain. It was a motto, the kind that once adorned crests and club invitations. I had heard it before. A phrase from a buried scandal, a ghost of a society long since dissolved. Something to do with initiations, rituals. The exquisite cruelty of clever young minds allowed too much privacy. Oxford, for all its intellectual architecture, has always nurtured a darker kind of garden behind the gates. The society had no name officially, at least none that remained in the archives. Just that phrase, passed like a cipher among the initiated. Clara's essay. The unfinished lecture. The ghost of accusation in her last writing. It had been more than theory. She was unearthing something. Not metaphor, but memory. Rook's departure. Vale's silence. Merton's thin-skinned bitterness. And Searle. Always poised, always pointed, speaking of Clara with admiration laced in acid. They had been a cohort. Once, this photograph was the sediment of some early brilliance. And something else. Something broken. Lewis had said it first without realizing. They were all close, apparently. That kind of close that curdles when it sours. I held the photograph under the lamp, staring at the way they stood. Not a group, but an arrangement. Merton slightly turned away. Searle leaning in, one hand barely touching Clara's elbow. Rook looking not at the camera, but at Clara. And Clara herself, still distant, already stepping out of the frame. And the tulip, fresh, singular, yellow. In another context, a tulip might have meant spring or reverence. But not here, not that color, not in that house, not mourning, an apology. I saw it suddenly, like a pattern emerging from damp paper. Someone had left it not to grieve, but to confess, without words, without courage. A message pressed gently against a silence too long kept. Not suicide, then. Not in the way people imagined it. Something more layered. Clara was preparing to speak, not only through lectures or essays, but through memory, through the slow, dangerous act of naming. And someone too afraid to be named, had sent the flower in return. A gesture not of guilt, but of dread. I replaced the frame without comment, left the light as it was. The past was still here, arranged like books on Clara's shelf. Neat. Understandable. Until you reached the one spine that had no title. Outside, the moon broke through the cloud cover just enough to silver the chapel's edge. Somewhere, a bicycle clattered faintly into the distance. I stood in the middle of her room, listening for something that would not come. The air held, and then, almost kindly, held back. Aaron Lister was found at Heathrow, dishevelled and hollow-eyed, attempting to board a flight to Vienna with a ticket purchased in haste and confusion. The immigration officer who flagged him described him as shaking but polite, the kind of young man who says sir too often when frightened. In interview he folded quickly, not with guilt, but with exhaustion. "I didn't kill her," he said, before Lewis had even sat down. But I was there. His story was disjointed, interrupted by nerves and the deep tremor of someone who'd rehearsed his version too many times. He had arrived at Clara's that night after receiving a message. Come if you can, no questions. He had keys, sometimes used them. When he entered, the house was too still. Clara was in the bath, motionless, no robe, no glass of wine, no music, the tap still dripping, but she was breathing, barely. Penelope was gone. The door had not been locked behind her. I panicked, he whispered. She had told me things, about what she was going to publish, about the society, about the others. I thought maybe it had been staged to silence her. So he wiped everything. No fingerprints, no towel, no soap. He didn't call an ambulance. She hated hospitals, he said weakly, and I thought maybe she'd wake up. The tulip was his. He'd brought it earlier that afternoon. A quiet gesture. She loved yellow, said it was the only honest color. And the morphine. She asked for it, he said. Weeks ago, for pain, old injury. I didn't think... He stopped, looked down. Didn't think she'd use it all. Morse found Penelope Searle in a borrowed house on the cliffs of Cornwall, sea spray lashing the windows like regret. Her sister answered the door and tried to lie. A moment later, Penelope emerged, hair tied back, jumper 2 sizes too large. No performance this time. They spoke in the kitchen. The kettle was on, but no one made tea. She had the final draft, Penelope said, staring at the grain of the table. It was going to name all of us. Not directly, but enough that anyone who remembered would know. Morse said nothing. She wasn't going to publish it in a journal, she went on. She was going to present it, at that ridiculous lecture, to a room full of students and colleagues. She said, "Truth needs witnesses." Her voice cracked slightly. I begged her to wait. I said it wasn't fair, that it was cruel, that no one cared anymore anyway, that it would only bring damage. She said damage was the point. She paused. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear that. What did you mean to do? Morse asked quietly. I don't know, Penelope said. Convince her, scare her maybe. Not physically, just symbolically. Remind her of what happened the last time someone tried to speak out. She stood, pacing. She said she'd already taken something, that it would take time. I thought she was bluffing, or maybe just being dramatic. She had a way of staging everything. Morse looked at her. So you left her? In the tub. Why? She turned. The mask slipped. Something old and unresolved surfaced beneath her eyes. As a warning, she said, to make her think about what it would mean, about being exposed, alone, clean and empty. Silence. Only the kettle boiling behind them now, forgotten. I didn't think, she whispered. I didn't think she would die quite so fast. Back in Oxford, Morse stood once more in the bathroom of number 7, Wycliffe Crescent. The tap had been fixed, the tiles scrubbed, the tulip was gone, but the stillness remained. Clean, yes, but not peaceful. The crossword still sat on the bedside table. He picked it up. To drown in silence. 6. He stared. He wrote, sober. Underneath he added another word. One not part of the puzzle, but one he could no longer ignore. Forgiven. Evening settled like a hush over Oxford, the light dimming to the soft grey of memory. Morse stood at the window of his flat, holding a glass of red wine he wasn't really drinking. The gramophone crackled to life behind him, releasing Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major into the room, slow and unhurried, music that didn't demand anything but allowed things to drift. The crossword lay finished on the table. The clue? To drown in silence. 6. Now resolved. Sober. He had circled it with a deliberate hand, as if finality required a gesture. He sat down, glass untouched, and opened the folded letter once more. The one Rook had given him, written by Clara 2 days before her death. The misquoted Dawn still caught at him. Each man's death lessens me, for I'm truly an island. Not quite the famous line. Just enough off to signal it wasn't forgetfulness. Clara had never been careless with words. Morse knew that now. The misquote was a nudge, not an error. She had seen what was coming, not just the silence of her colleagues or the buried scandal they'd all agreed to pretend never happened, but the soft violence of forgetting, of being erased under polite academic shrugs. He imagined her writing the letter, already fragile, already hollowed by something she had carried alone for too long. Not guilt exactly, nor martyrdom. Something more like weariness, a decision to cleanse, to rid herself of all remaining ties, to be, in the end, clean. The lecture she never gave, the pages she tore away, the bath, full but unwelcome. She had dried herself before climbing in. She had planned everything but her own fragility. Morse leaned back, the creak of the chair echoing in the otherwise quiet flat. Outside, street lamps began to bloom in the mist, casting Oxford in a soft halo of gold and grey. Students passed below, muffled laughter and umbrellas. The wine remained untouched. He wasn't in the mood for forgetting. On the counter by the sink, something yellow caught his eye. A tulip. One. He walked over, picked it up. No note, no water. Just left there. Someone had entered while he was out, or perhaps before. It didn't matter. He carried the tulip back to the gramophone and set it down beside the wine glass. Clara's story was finished, but not closed. Not in the way official reports liked things closed. The will would be read. Searle would be quietly removed from the college. Vale would retire early. Rook would remain in exile, though less bitter now. Aaron Lister would grieve in silence. Whether for Clara or for what he had lost in himself, Morse didn't know. And Morse? He sat still, listening to Schubert. The flat was quiet. The crossword was complete. And somewhere beneath the music, beneath the layers of grief and dignity and wrongness that Clara had carried like a thesis, too long rewritten, there was something that felt almost like forgiveness. The tulip began to wilt. He didn't move. The end.